Hey guys, this is Eric Weingarten with Weingarten Racing. Today's video is answering your questions, and this is ones from last Saturday. So last Saturday I said if you got questions, put them in, and I'd answer them this. I do these videos about twice a week. Because of that, these videos aren't that really visually appealing. Like there's not a lot of stuff to look, check this out and show you. It's more of an audio one. So if you're one of those guys that likes to work on different stuff while you play a video, this is probably the one. As a note on the audio, it may not sound the greatest too because right now it's windy and it's trying to push the garage door in and out, and that's why you hear that creaking in the background. I can't control Mother Nature, it is what it is. So I'm gonna answer as many questions as I can. I'm gonna limit myself to about 15 minutes just because I gotta get stuff done. And also I know you guys as well probably don't watch all the way through. Most of you don't, looking at the analytics. So, but anytime I change a question, I'll hold up this card. So if you are happen to watch this, you see me flash up a card, that means I've changed the next question because maybe it's not a question you really want to hear, so we go on. So let's go ahead and get started so I can get as many as I can get done. First one was, do I do dual overhead cam engines as far as porting and stuff? And the answer is absolutely not. You got to know where you belong, and I don't belong in that world because I don't have any experience with the 4-valve stuff. And in all fairness, this is me being a dick because I can be. Most of that 4-valve stuff was on 4-cylinder stuff, so my idea that I would spend time porting a head to make, and even with their turbo, to make only as much power as a naturally aspirated mild V8 didn't seem appealing to me. Don't get me wrong, I know there are plenty that make more, but it's just not my world. It's just not, I know now for sure they make considerably more power, but it's just not something I'm interested in, so no, I don't do that. Next question, someone asked, will you do a leak down on the LS 408 cubic inch engine after the cam challenge and do one before? And the answer is no. I don't have time for that, and it will make no difference. Just to give you an idea, like the small block had like 250 something dyno pulls on it. I didn't do a leak down, but I'm sure if I did, it'd be the same, except for the one cylinder where the head gasket has problems. That has nothing to do with it. So no. Next question, someone asked me if I do AMC heads. It's weird because once you become like a popular reporter, you get asked, do you do these, and it's all weird heads. No, I try to stick with the domestic V8 aluminum 2-valve per cylinder heads. That's it. Unfortunately, you're like, well, that's AMC. No, I don't even have the fixtures like these to flow the head. There's no sense in buying them for the one customer you might get in 2 years. Sorry, and I know it sucks because I'm sure that it's pretty limited, but it's not a money maker. I mean, after all, I am in it for knowledge, but to know more about AMC stuff makes no really difference to me because it's not like I'm going to do anything with the AMC, and it's just, get what I'm saying? And I'm not trying to knock you, because if you're a fan base and you've got that, stick with it, love it. Just understand, just because you love something doesn't mean that other people do too. It's just nature of the beast. This next one deals with cast iron heads. I get asked several times, can you port these cast iron heads? At least once a week. And they always start off with, and they'll call me up and be like, hey man, I watch your channel, love your channel. Can you port these 781 big block Chevy heads? And each time I give I'm on the phone, but in my mind I'm giving them the look like, what? And so then my next question usually is, so you watch all my videos? Yep. And then I have to say, do you watch them all the way to the end? Well, I try to, because if you watch to the end, 99% of the videos end with, I do not port cast iron heads. And I don't know anybody that does. I've had the whole video about why I don't do that. But why don't I port cast iron heads? Here's why. It's not because I got this in a bunch of comments. You're not manly enough to manly people port cast iron heads. I did it for like 10 years. So you can use that all you want, but here's the reason why people ever ported cast iron heads. It's the only reason. They couldn't afford it. They could not afford aluminum heads. Or they had rules that allowed you to only run cast iron heads. So the people that were porting cast iron heads got their cast iron heads ported because they couldn't afford nice aluminum heads. That's period, that was it. For the majority of people. The only other ones were the ones that had rules. So at the time, so when I was first porting cast iron heads, it made sense because, well, they could save money having me port their cast iron heads versus buying aluminum. That ship sailed long ago. First off, the shipping costs have gone through the roof, so since the cast iron head weighs more, it costs more to ship. So it's now, and also the cast iron, there's not as many foundries that actually pour cast iron heads, so the cost of an actual cast iron head right now is the same, if not higher than an aluminum head, and shipping is even more. The other thing with it was on cast iron heads, there's nothing more frustrating, and this has happened to me a few times. So they used to have a mud truck rule, or I think it was a pulling truck class actually, up in the Northeast or something. And they were running the RHS cast iron big block heads. If you ever pick those up, they're about 80 pounds of cast iron for one head. And anyway, they're trying to make them flow as best they can. And I mean, I had a whole 60 hours in this one head, and I think it was perfect. Wouldn't you know it, last port hits water. And I know people can repair them, but they are rare and few and far between. There's nothing more crushing than just knowing you just wasted 80 hours, or 60 hours actually in that one, for one head. But really it's gonna be another 60 because you gotta get another head and redo it. And it wasn't because like, well, didn't you take measurements? Oh, absolutely. The problem is one shift in the sanding core and you're starting all over. Now, I cannot begin to tell you how bad that sucks. So, no, I only do aluminum heads. They're much easier to repair. Not that all of them can be repaired, but that's the reason for it. And this also brings to another question. A lot of the circle jack guys have to run cast iron heads. I do think that's eventually going to become a thing of the past, because for the majority, a lot of the classes that required cast iron heads, there were two options. You had Dart and you had EQ. For the IMCA modified heads, the ones that are spec legal. And also World, I should point out. Most people didn't run the World because they don't make power. Then you're left with IMCA, the EQ ones, or the Dart ones. Well, Dart's kind of like, since private equity took over that business, they decided, and that's what they did to it. So that head's pretty much dead from them. So that's really leaving you with just EQ. And no offense to World, they aren't as good. And EQ itself, I don't know how many they're making or whatnot, so I think they're limiting it to maybe their foundry, because they don't have their own foundry. Whoever does that, probably not where. Point being is, you're one foundry away from having no cast iron heads, period. So I look, and a lot of the classes have started doing this, where they've gone to either a spec head, which Brodix makes the majority of the spec heads. They're aluminum, say, track one head, and they'll have a spec logo in the intake. Maybe someday I'll show you. And that's what a lot of the circle track classes run. The bad side from a cylinder head guy like myself, to me, it's kind of screwed up. They do not cut any break to cylinder head guys to sell those heads. So for instance, even though I'm WD or Master WD with Brodix, on that IMCA head, if you're a dealer like me and you buy that head, it costs the same if you're Joe Schmo that went and bought that head. So I'm making no money on that head, period. So if I upcharge from that, then it's more expensive than if Joe Schmo does it. So then Joe Schmo brings me the head to do it. So at that point, it's just labor. Now you're like, well, how's that work? Because what they do on those spec heads, and to me, this is like a corrupt system. But what they'll do is on that spec head, what they would have paid to like dealers like us to make up the difference. So Joe Schmo gets a certain price, we get a little bit less. That goes into our pocket. Instead of that money that would have gone to our pocket, they give it to the race organization. And don't take this wrong, but a lot of the race organizations give very little payouts to the winners, and a lot, it seems like, to themselves. And I'm being general, and they're not all that way, obviously, but it feels like the overall organizations take more of the money, the actual local places get very little of it, like the track owners themselves, and so on and so forth, and especially the racers. So I'm not a fan of spec heads. The other one that I've gone to is a lot of them are running now the Brodix IK heads. Those are the cheapest aluminum heads, American-made aluminum heads you could get. And they're a pretty good head, and I sell quite a few of them myself, and I've done videos on those. So those are out there too. So that's what a lot of the tracks are going to. And if you think that's a problem, I haven't even gotten into it. This is not really related to this question. Is the camshafts are about to really hit you in the head too, because most of those circle track guys have to run a flat tappet camshaft. And I'll warn you, if you were to call me up and say, hey, Eric, I got a big block Chevy and I want you to port the heads. What heads can you get for me? And I'll ask you what can running. Well, I'm running a flat tappet camshaft. I almost immediately want to go click, bam. Because there's no sense in you telling me you want some nice heads and you're running a flat tappet camshaft. And before you're like, you idiot. No. They're more reliable. No, that's long gone for sure. Yeah. But anyway, the circle track classes, a lot of them have to run flat tappet camshafts. Here's the thing you need to know of, and Daniel Powell probably has talked about this. There is only a few companies, like two, that actually make the core That's just the basic part of the camshaft in your flat tappet deals. Only 2. And one of them said, we're done after we run out of inventory. So once they're done, which means there'll be only one company who slightly puts out anything. So if you were a flat tappet guy and you're believing in that, hate to tell you, you're about to run out of cams themselves. So roller is going to be the way to go, and I look for that to be the change that happens in circle track. Anyway, so there's that question. Sorry. Next one was, do you port heads to match the cam? Absolutely not. It should be the other way around. You port the heads for what the engine needs. So a customer calls me up and says, hey, I've got this so-and-so engine. What heads do you recommend? I will ask them what cubic inch size they are and how many max RPMs they turn and what they're using it for. So if it's for drag racing, I know that they're really going to be in a narrow band that's up at the top. If it's street strip, I want to make them a bit broader. If it's circle track, it's a bit broader even then. If you're like, I just don't do any racing, it's strictly street, then it's really a lower range. All those RPM bands and the size of the engine dictate what head should be ran on that engine. And this goes to another question that you're going to get later on. But the head itself, once you get that RPM and size of the engine, you pretty much know what size it is. What size you should have that makes the best power within that range. Now, will it make the best overall peak power? No. For instance, if you're a street engine, I'm targeting a lower RPM, but I know I could put on a bigger head that would make more power, but it will not be in the range you're running. And also probably not work with the camshaft that you have. So point being is, you do not port the head for the cam. You port the head for the engine, then you put the cam for that same engine. So you try to get the cam to match the heads and the engine. You make the heads match the engine. So don't do it the other way around. Bad idea. It's way cheaper to change a cam than it is heads. Next one is, what head gaskets work with aluminum heads? Really, almost any head gasket will work with aluminum heads. It's how well they will work. Most people have switched to MLS gaskets, but your surface on both your heads and your deck has to be perfectly smooth. Otherwise, they will leak. It's just a matter of time. So you can run a composite gasket. There's 2 types. There's one that's got a copper O-ring and one that's got a steel. There's something called brittling. So if you run a steel head gasket, it's fine. It will seal up just fine on an aluminum head, cast iron block, seal up just fine. But when you take off the head, you'll see an imprint on the head where the head gasket was. That's called brittling. It's not a big deal. You just need to get your head surfaced before they go back on. It's not and we're talking like it might remove 3,000 or 4,000 to get rid of that. It's not a big thing at all. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you get the copper ring, it won't brittle like that and it still seals. So anyway, there's that question. Now I'm going to try to, I've gotten several others here, so we'll go through these as quickly as I can. So I did some of these comments, but who knows? Oh, this is an interesting one. This came up because I've been interviewing people and asking about, probably should put this up. So I've been interviewing cam competitors and asking how they pick their camshafts. And several people, this will answer a whole lot of questions that came up, how I actually pick the camshafts. So I've asked them, and this is how I've done it. For years and years and years, it had been strictly duration and LSA. And kinda. Because if you look at the camshaft card, you look at your duration, your LSA, and that's kind of how I pick it, but not entirely. So let me kind of tell you more of the secret sauce on how to do it. And remember, and this should be the pointed out really, really good. Just because two different ways people pick camshafts doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong. A lot of times they can get to very similar camshafts, especially when you see the cam cards that are picked and you realize how many people got the same and the way that they're picking them is different. You get what I'm saying. Just because you do things different doesn't mean it's wrong, necessarily. Don't get me wrong, people still can make stupid decisions on picking camshafts. But, so what I would look at is I want RPM, what RPM I need. And the other thing about this is I'm looking at past Dyno experience and what camshaft I've ran with that. And I was thinking, well, if I change the intake duration so much, will it bring the peak up or peak down as far as where power is occurring? Same with torque. But then I ended up getting some software and that really helped. So someone in the comments said, David Visor is the only one that has a formula that works with that. That's completely incorrect. There are so many out there, it's unreal. So that's That's completely false. So one of them I use is performance trends, because what I would do was, and this is going to seem confusing, so bear with me. I would start looking at, I need a certain amount of duration to make it peak at a certain point. So this size engine, in past experience, it took this duration with this head to make it peak at this point in the RPM curve. And I want it to peak later, I'm going to add a little bit more duration or whatnot. And this opening and closing events comes into this. So what happened was I started using performance trends, and they give you this, when you type in the stuff and it runs a simulation, it tells you this. So it will tell you one overlap, which is huge. So mathematically you could figure it out, but it's nicer to have a computer do it for you. So it could tell you on the exhaust side how much overlap you have, and that overlap is in a combination of the LSA and duration. So, you know, if you add more duration on intake and exhaust, that overlap, if you keep the same LSA, it's going to make it bigger, you know, or so you could spread out your LSA and there's less. So I would look at one, how much overlap I had, because I usually have a desired target that I had in mind for certain RPMs and whatnot. The other thing that it did, which was really, really helpful, is it would tell you the theoretical cranking compression. And just from my dyno experience, on a higher compression engine, if you can get the cranking compression between 220 to 240, keep that, work with your duration and your LSAs to make that happen. So you got a duration that you think is going to make a peak power up there at the certain RPM that you want, and the exhaust that would make it carry a certain amount that you want from dyno experience. And you could see how your LSA would affect your overlap one, and then how did your cranking compression come into play, like what to do with that. And then you might advance the cam, because that's when the opening point gets to where you want it to be, and that would also change both the cranking and the, not necessarily the overlap, but could change the cranking because of where it's being drawn from. So there's a lot more that goes into it than besides just the duration and LSA. They are all a combination, and I know that's like confused the shit out of you if you listen to that. The point is dyno experience, I'll look at the duration of that cam that I've used before. If I alter from that or a different head, I might use less duration or more duration. I'll put it into the program. Same with the exhaust. I'll put it into the program and see general LSA. I'll put in there just to see what that cranking ratio is. I'll then alter it with the LSA to make sure I'm still getting into my target overlap and see what that cranking compression is. So I might shrink some of the duration sometimes to make up for that too. Again, it's really complicated. Now on a street deal, on a lower compression deal, I won't do the 220 to 240 cranking compression. I usually target between 150, and that's really, really street, mild-mannered type of deal where you got power brakes and stuff. And then on a more aggressive one, I might target all the way up to 180 to 190. So for instance, that 355 small block Chevy, that was cranking 190. That was running on pump gas. It was only 11, I think it was 11.8 to 1. So it's a little higher as far as the actual dynamic compression. Sorry, whatever, static compression. Whichever one, I'm tongue-tied on this deal. But point being is that one pumped 190. Ran fine, did not knock. But I targeted the camshaft to get within that range. So there's a lot that goes into it. There's lots of formulas that people use, but don't knock them for that. So that was a really complicated way of saying how I pick a camshaft, and there's always variables. So sometimes I'm like, well, one thing's more important than the other. It just changes. So, all right. Anyway, so when you're hearing some of these competitors are talking about how they pick a camshaft, don't knock the way they do it. Just understand. My biggest thing I could tell you this is what you need to do if you want to really be good at picking a camshaft, because several people asked, how do I get good about picking camshafts? One, if you call us up, and this happens religiously every single week, a customer will either call or they will email, and they'll say this, and this is no joke, and I'm sure Daniel Powell, Chris Straub, Brian Tooley, whoever deals with the same thing. You'll get a customer that calls up and they'll inevitably say, hey, I've got this engine. I'm looking between this camshaft, the Comp 12-57-19 versus the Elgin 39-29-2. Every time you put in a part number, I don't have a effing clue what you're talking about as far as what camshaft is. And you're like, well, you can go look it up. If you don't have the effort to go look up that camshaft and tell me what the actual specs are, I'm just not. You came to me for help. So use your time, your effort's worth, my time's worth money, yours is worth, so go get it. Don't write a part number for a camshaft and expect us to memorize that. Because all of us cam guys, we don't deal in shelf cams. We deal in custom cams. So When we want to know what the Camshaft specs are, don't tell us the part number, tell them the duration, the LSA. It'd be great if you had a cam card, but even then, it's inevitable people will ask us to pick them a shelf cam because they don't want to buy a custom cam, even though they're like within 50. So getting something perfect for your combination or something that you magically picked out because certain formula that you saw on the internet makes a difference. I would say the biggest thing to do is to listen to everybody's camshaft thing. And if you're still totally confused, which you probably should be unless this is your life, go to a custom cam grinder and have them pick you one. Don't give them handicaps too, because this has happened to me, and I know it happened to Daniel because I was talking to him, and I'm sure it happens to literally every cam grinder. You spec a camshaft, you tell them, look, this is a camshaft I think it's going to work. And by the way, I charge to spec a camshaft. So if you come to me and you're like, because you'll email me like, hey, I got this combination, I'd like you to spec me a camshaft. Awesome. I charge $100 to spec a camshaft. What? It takes time. Time is money. So I was talking to Gerald Brand. This is a little side note. And he goes, look, you got to charge for what you're worth. Because I would rather be poor sitting down than poor working my butt off. So yeah, I do charge for cam specs. But anyway, it's best you go to a cam person and say, hey, tell me what you want. But what you shouldn't do when you do that is give them handicaps by like saying, hey, look, I like your specs, but what if we did it on a 107? Or what if we did, even though you might like 110, this is going to be perfect. Put it on a 107. I don't want to do a 550 lift. Can you do a 505 lift? When they're giving you that, they're giving you what they think is the absolute best. And if you choose to ignore it, all it does is infuriate us. I shouldn't say infuriates. It makes us as the people that are designing the cams or picking the cams for you not want to do business with you, because you're going to run that cam. It isn't going to do as well as you want. You're going to blame the cam guy that spec'd it and be like, yours doesn't run well. Well, you asked me to do so-and-so, and it's going to end up biting us in the back. So anyway, that one went a little bit long. I got a few more questions, and I'm going to probably run out of time. Sorry that we didn't get to all these. I'm going to go quick. It says, on a trick flow small block Mopar heads, have I done anything? Yes, there was one in the shop that I did, and it wasn't horrible. It did well, so it asked me if I ported it. The exhaust side, I couldn't see a way to improve it because the ports are too small. Chrysler's, my God. On the intake side, I cut out to a larger intake valve. It picked up flow overall the curve, but the peak was down a little bit at the peak where it occurred, but after the peak again, and that's from boarding. I wasn't entirely happy with it, but I was so afraid that I would you have other problems with your Chrysler stuff, that I'd break through the old passage that comes up to the top that does for the rockers, and I didn't also know where the water passage is. But for what he was doing, I think it was actually perfect. I think it's going to make way more power than it did before. Looking at the flow bench numbers, it wouldn't look that way though. It looked like it was going to be slightly better. All right, question. This is from Tom Z1Q. When porting NA cylinder heads for limited valve application like performance street endurance rates, how do you determine the relationship between current area and the other key factors? First off, if you're not limited, if your rules do not dictate how much lift you have, then to me, it's almost, don't put that in there. So I'm of the more lift is better, which I actually, and I know I keep coming back to Daniel Powell, we literally talked for like an hour and a half. Poor guy didn't have power, so he had time to talk. But we were actually talking about this, and I said, every time I've increased lift, it had made more power. And he may work with me to do a test like this, because I had said this was like 2008 Engine Masters Challenge. We were running flat tappet cams there because they made us by rules. And I had done a 1.3 rocker to break it in, and it made 530. This is on Dunbar Dyno too. It made 530 horsepower. This was a small cam, like a 244, 246. I don't remember what the low lift was, but with the 1.3 rocker ratio, it made 530 horsepower. Put the Jessel shaft rockers on it, because we were breaking in with the 1.3s, in case you're wondering. Put the 1.9 rocker ratio from Jessel on there. The power instantly jumped to 585 horsepower. So that's a 65 horsepower increase from going from a 1.3 to a 1.9 rocker ratio. Nothing else was changed. So anyway, I'm talking to Daniel about this, and he's right, and it's a good thought. The problem is when you change rocker ratios, you're doing not one thing, you're doing several things. So one, you increase lift, obviously, but the other thing, what you did is you made that load much faster. So you made the reaction in which the valve opens faster. So the 1.3, it's opening at a much slower rate than at a 1.9 because you still have the same similar duration numbers. The rocker ratio also gives you a little bit more duration, but even then, the valve action's quicker. So really what you tested was you found out that the faster rocker, the faster valve movement, the little bit extra duration with the rocker, and maybe the valve lift all made that 65 horsepower. So I said, well, then maybe we could do something different where we have the same lobe, and then we keep the same rocker ratio and see if that could change just by lift. But he goes, there's another catch, which he's right. If you have a duration that's the same, I'm just gonna use arbitration numbers. Let's say you had a 240 degrees intake duration number, but you had a lobe that gives you, and I'm just arbitration, 650 lift. And you keep the same 240 duration, but you do a 550 lift. The 550 lift has to be a less aggressive lobe. It has to, because if you think about it, during that 240 degrees of duration time, the one that has a 650 lift, the valve has to move faster to reach the 650 in that window of 240 degrees. With a 550 lift, it's actually going slower because it has to keep to get to the 550 versus the 650. So even then, what you'd end up doing is you're testing not only lift, it's the acceleration of the valve as well. So essentially you're making the engine feel like it's got a more aggressive cam as far as opening. Now there's ways around it to make it the less difference. It will never be the same as if we open up the duration. So like instead of running a 240, we ran something like a 260. Because as the duration's larger, that acceleration ramp to get to them will be less. It will still not be the same, so that's kind of the catch, but it will be less. So maybe we'll have less impact on the speed. Future times I plan to test just that. But anyway, didn't really answer your question on that, but point being is there's no reason why you should limit your lift. I personally haven't seen a loss of power from limited lift. At worst case, you make the same with more lift. But on a road race deal and street stuff, don't feel like, and this is old school thinking, 500 lift, anything more than that's just gonna wear out parts. That's old school garbage. It truly is. It's a myth that keeps passing around. It's garbage. Even modern LSs have more than 550. I think like 560, almost 600 valve lift. Big deal. So you can run 600 valve lift on that, but as far as what you do with the port, again, it goes back to the RPM. So on a street deal, there's no sense in making it flow a lot of air whenever you're not turning a lot of RPMs anyways. It just doesn't make any sense. So on street and circle track stuff like this, I usually shrink down the ports, and on the bench, my goal is to get it to carry the airflow as much as possible, even in lifts beyond what you're running, so that I know that the port's stable, but by making it as small as possible within the mathematical calculation of how small it can be before it goes into sonic choke, and we have pumping losses, which hopefully you get that. So what percent to the bowl, and that's the other thing. You can't even use that percent from bowl to that, because they change per cylinder head. So on a small block Chevy, for instance, we run a dramatically bigger bowl than I would in an LS. And the reason for it is I have to, small block Chevy is a 23-degree head. I have to slow that air to go over that short side, as opposed to an LS where it's 15 or even 11 degree for these. So, and it's raised up, so it doesn't need a big bowl to slow the air to make a turn. So you can't use the same percent. So even if I told you one, if you tried using it on a different head, it'd be pointless. It wouldn't work very well. Which, this comes to another question. This is probably gonna be the last one because I know I'm over time, and I'm sorry I didn't get to all your questions. Someone asked, can you have a head that flows too much for the engine? And they had actually mentioned my Dragon Slayers as far as putting it on a 355. Yeah, what happens is, and it works both ways, it's the same as having too much CSA for the engine and having too much airflow for the engine, because this is really important to understand. Airflow is tied to size. The bigger the port, the more air it flows in general. Now, don't get me wrong, we make it more efficient, work better than what it was at a smaller size. But in general, the larger you make a port, the more it flows air. So, say my Dragon Slayers are 253 cc's, they flow like 330s at 700, and they'll peak at like 340 at way up there, right? Well, it's still a pretty big head. Minimum cross section is like 2.7. If you want to put that on a 350 at 7,000 RPM, what you now have is, yeah, it flows 330 at 700 and 340 at peak. The engine only needed 300, which my head will exceed that at 600 left. Well, actually a 500 lift. So what you've done is you've given it way more air than it can need, and the engine's only going to take in as much air as it needs. So having the ability for that head to flow more does nothing for that engine. It can't take advantage of it. So when you put that on there, if it only needed 300, say, we could give you a good example. You put on the AFR 195 head on a 355, it flows about 300 CFM. We then put my Dragon Slayer on. What will happen is that AFR head flows 300. So the entire time, one, because the port's smaller and it flows just enough for the needs, all the way probably to 6,000 or 7,000 or 6,000 really, it's going to be just kicking the dog crap out of my Dragon Slayer, even though mine flows 40 CFM more, because the engine's not needing 40 CFM more. So instead, the whole port's lazy, it can't move enough air because it's bigger because of the amount of air that it moves. The engine can't use that air anyway, even if it could get, so it's not helping it. You say, well, that's small block Chevy. This is the classic problem with the LS. The LS3 head, if you look at it, that head flows 360, right, on a lot of our ported ones. And you're like, that's it? Plenty. Anyway, you can make them flow 380, it won't matter. So you take your LS3, your like 370 something cubic inches, doesn't matter. It doesn't need 360 CFM, especially if you're only going 6,500 RPM. It does not need that. Nor does it need, because at least in a small block world, our cross sections are smaller, our minimum cross section. So we have the torque going in. We can make it bigger to go up higher. But on an LS3, that pinch is like 3.2. That's good for 8,300 RPM. So if you have an LS engine, your 6 liter, and you're going 6,500 RPM, you now have a head that flows way more than what it needs, because it's only probably needing 320. And you're giving it 360, so it can't even use the extra 40 CFM, so your percent of gain from that extra CFM drops dramatically. It also has such a large cross section at the minimum, so it's not like making torque. And then I can already hear the guys, LS's make more torque. No. The way that they get around that, so this is your Band-Aid, they run really small camshafts. I mean, if you look at when you see the camshafts of this LS Challenge, they've got such a small duration stuff, because instead to get that, because the port's so big, to get the airspeed up, what they do is they make the durations really small on the camshaft. So it's like already pulling hard when that valve opens, so it can speed up, force the air in the runner to make as much speed as possible for it to make torque. And that's partly why when you put a bigger camshaft in the LS, with those big old ports, they don't really run. They for sure don't make torque. They make a bunch of peak power way later in the RPM, but they ain't making the torque because its port's so big. Then it acts more like a regular small block Chevy. You put it in too big of a head, it's not really great down low, and then it really starts making it. So the LSs are compensating by putting in such small camshafts. Hopefully that kind of explains it. So the point is, the engine can only use what it needs. So you give it 360 and it needs 300, it's still only going to take 300. So your gains are small. And this may explain why, if you have a stock LS3 and you just do the basic work on the LS3 heads, like I did on the Dyno on the 408, the stock LS3 Dyno Mule heads, which are 823s, just redid the valve job. Those made only 8 horsepower less than the AFR Enforcers that flowed 20 CFM more than they did. So, and that's at peak. And even the lower ones, it was at lower lifts at 400 was flowing 20 more. So what you have is, it had more flow, it couldn't use any of it. The size was already still bigger than when it was going anyway, so didn't need it. And you got all of 8 horsepower gain. And that's because it had enough that it needed, you didn't do that. And that's why on an LS engine, cams make more power than heads, typically, because you got more than what you need. So you need the cam to either band-aid the head being too big, or to make it run up top so it can use the head. So I can already tell, Liger don't know what you're talking. That's why I Dyno. But anyway, this is way longer than I thought. I don't know how long this is. Remember, I don't port cast iron heads. I am no Superman. I guarantee there's probably stuff I said that was wrong in here. And I know the LS guy's like, yeah, because that whole thing you said was wrong. But I can tell you from experience on the Dyno, that's what's happened. So anyway, with this LS cam challenge that you're going to see soon enough, you'll see that also as far as like because some of the people have guessed like these humongous cams, which if we were going to 8,500 or 9,000, you'd have a winner, but not in this 4,000 to 7,000, which that's not a small RPM range either. And can I point this out too? I gotta say, this isn't driving me nuts. This isn't even in one of the questions, but it's bugging me. Would you people that are going like, you should pull it to 2,000 to 4,000. I want to see what it does on the street. You guys do not understand how the dyno works. And I hate to slap it to you, and I'm not trying to insult you, but a dyno, the way we do it, we go wide open. I say this because that's how we open the throttle. We're wide open, like wide open, full throttle, full load at 2,200 RPM. In a street vehicle, you're going wide open at 2,200 RPM with full load. So in other words, you've got max trailer. I just want to get this right. Max trailer, more than max trailer, wide open throttle at 2,200 RPM. And you're just going to hold it there. Don't downshift. You're going to hold it at 2,200 RPM, all in, max load. No, you're not. No vehicle does that, period. For one, it shifts down. And why does it shift down? Because it brings you up to where your peak torque is. There's no reason you guys should focus on the 2,200 horsepower range or 2,200 RPM range on a dyno at wide open throttle. Nobody besides a boat would do that. You're like, no, it's better for towing. You're confusing that. The torque at 2,200 RPM at wide open throttle is not what you need. What you need to be thinking about is, what's the torque at part throttle at 2,200 RPM? Not full throttle. Full load, part load. Because if you're doing 2,200 RPM and you're pulling a trailer or whatnot, I promise you, you're not wide open throttle. You're partly in it. And that's what you would need. A dyno could do that if I could set up a throttle position sensor to see 30% throttle. Let's see what torque it makes or whatever. That's different, but not wide open. So when you're asking for those numbers, it's ridiculous. My Dodge Ram, your Chevy pickup, your Ford pickup, you put a full load on it, you're going up a hill, it shifts down and it goes up to that 4,000. So if you're wondering why I'm testing at 4,000, that's where you're running your torque. So please stop doing that. Those are, of all the numbers I ever give, if I dyno down at 2,200 or 2,500 RPM, those are the most worthless ones you could ever have. And I know you guys with torque think, no, that's important. That's going to show us the torque. No, it's not. You are not going to be full throttle, full wide open throttle, full load, 2,200 RPM, and not downshifting. You just aren't. If you did, then you need to fix your kickdown cable and put more gear in your truck. Anyway, I'm no Superman. I don't pour cast iron heads. You guys take care.